In one of my other videos, we talked about how to dress up a store-bought cake with chocolate lace wraps. Now I'm going to show you another way to dress up a store-bought cake, which is actually somewhat simpler. It involves a stenciling technique, not dissimilar from stenciling on a cookie, but we're going to stencil with chocolate on acetate and wrap it around the cake. The finished result is what you see on the counter. You can use any cake stencil whatsoever. I happen to choose one that looks sort of like a fleur-de-lis pattern. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But you could make a stencil of your own. You can buy stencils. That particular stencil came from designerstencils.com, which is one of my favorite sources of both cake and cookie stencils. So to get started, I've got my store-bought cake. This one is 8 inches across. It's about 2 inches tall. And with wrapping any cake with chocolate lace, you want to make sure the sides are squarely straight up and down, because if they're at some kind of angle and you wrap the chocolate around it, it'll also be angled. So the first thing I want to do is get off any bits of icing that are kind of overhanging. And I did the same technique with the lace cake earlier. This cake is actually pretty darn good. I see a bit of an overhang here, and because I'm right-handed, I'm going to rotate this cake around and swipe it off on this side. I'm using a bench scraper to do this, holding it vertically, and I've heated it a little bit. The heat of the blade will kind of melt that buttercream without me having to apply too much pressure. So I'm just kind of straightening that little overhang there, and otherwise it looks pretty good. I don't have to do much on this cake. I am going to take a small offset spatula and just knock down that bit there. That won't interfere with the application of the chocolate wrap, but it could make a more bumpy, wavy border if it's allowed to set up there. Because this icing is made with 100% butter, it gets really firm in the fridge, and so that's why you want to knock down any sort of overhangs or little high spots in the icing. So that looks good. A couple of other things to note about my setup here before we start wrapping it. It's important to get the cake up on the cake stand or whatever serving plate you're going to put it on before you wrap it, because once the chocolate wrap is on, it just is a little more difficult to move on to the final serving platter. The other thing that will make your life a whole heck of a lot easier is if you put it on a cake stand that actually has no lip on the edge, because we'll be wrapping a piece of acetate around the cake. If there's any kind of edge, you have to work harder to get that acetate to fit up flush against the sides of the cake. So choose one that doesn't have a lip. This actually has a teeny tiny one, but I don't think it's going to interfere. And the other thing to note, when working up on top of a cake stand, its center of gravity is a lot higher, so it's more tippy. And we'll be wrapping and applying a little bit of pressure to the cake as we wrap. So I like to have my cake stands anchored down. If I don't have somebody to hold it for me, I'll anchor it down with a little piece of floral clay. This is an adhesive thing that sticks onto my cutting board. It's hard to get off of fine work surfaces without that goo-be-gone de-adhesive stuff. So, beware of that. An alternative to keep your cake stand from skidding around is to just get like a rubber mat, some non-skid surface, and put that underneath, and that does the job pretty well as well. So that's a little bit on the setup. I'm going to move this cake aside, then I'm going to move in my apparatus for creating the template on acetate that we're going to wrap around this, and I'll show you how I measure that out. This cake, remember, is 8 inches wide and about 2 inches tall, and that's important because that's going to determine the size of the acetate that we wrap around the cake. So I'll be back in a bit. Okay, my cake's set aside, and I'm going to show you how I design the template that's going to be used to wrap the chocolate around the cake. Because this is a completely solid chocolate wrap, rather than working with parchment paper as I did before on my lace cake, which is in my other video, I'm going to work on acetate. I get this at the art supply store. You can get food grade acetate also online. I choose acetate for this, again, because it's solid chocolate. It's got a little more body to it, so when the chocolate's still fluid and I'm moving this around, it's less likely to flop around on me. It's just got a little more rigidity to it. The other cool thing about acetate, though, even if you don't temper the chocolate that you're putting onto it, when you peel off the acetate, the end result will be shinier than if you're working on parchment paper. A bit on tempering, I did throw that word in there, and that might have thrown you for a loop, but tempering is the process of taking chocolate through various temperatures so that it sets up very crisp and very quickly and very shiny. I do not do it for this particular technique, nor do I do it for the chocolate lace wraps, because I don't want my chocolate to set up too quickly before I'm ready to wrap the cake. If it does, then it's just going to crack when it goes around the cake. So I purposely do not temper it, but I'm very careful about sticking the chocolate in and out of the fridge at appropriate times so that the chocolate sets up without a cloudy haze. Sometimes if you leave the chocolate out too long and let it set up at room temperature, you'll notice that a kind of gray fuzzy haze forms on top. That's called bloom. We don't want that, and you can kind of suppress that by making sure the chocolate goes in and out of the refrigerator pretty darn quickly until the final time of service. Okay, so that said, a little bit about the chocolate. We're going to be doing a two-tone chocolate wrap, as you can see, using both white chocolate and a semi-sweet chocolate. And we're going to be stenciling that pattern on rather than hand piping it. So this is a little less intimidating for those of you who don't have a steady hand and don't want to do that lace wrap that I showed earlier. My cake was 8 inches across, so again, a little bit of math here. In order to fit the strip all the way around the cake, I need about pi, which if you remember from high school is 3.14159 times the diameter of the cake, which is 8. So I need about 24 inches plus a little extra for overlap at the end. So I measured this strip out to about 26 and a half inches, and that'll go all the way around that 8-inch cake. This is a strip I've used before. It's a little bit greasy, so I'm going to start with a clean strip for this. You can definitely reuse these, but I want to start with a really pristine one because if there's any smudges of chocolate or fingerprints on these, that can sometimes be transferred into the chocolate wrap. So I've got a strip here. Just comparing it to my original strip, you might wonder what this guide mark is here. I want to make sure that when I stencil, I'm going to use this stencil from Designer Stencils, that when I stencil onto the acetate, that this stenciled pattern doesn't move around. So I'm going to use that guide mark to gauge the where I place the bottom part of the stencil. And I'm going to have to stencil this strip 2 or 3 different times to get the entire pattern across the whole thing. So I think anchoring it about 3/8 inch off the bottom is going to be workable here. And I'm just going to show you how I put guide marks on the acetate. It's pretty straightforward. You can use a pen if it takes. Actually, I'm going to use my small ruler here because I think that's a little more manageable. Or you can use a Sharpie. But the key thing to remember is in writing on it is to flip it over after you write on it. Glasses are going on because I can barely read the ruler. So 3/8 inch. I'm just going to mark a point there, a point here, maybe a point in the middle, and just draw a straight lines between them all. Before you put the chocolate on it, you just want to flip it over so the pen mark doesn't transfer into the chocolate. It's okay if it smudges a little bit on this side because again, we're going to flip it over. That'll be my guide mark for locating the stencil. The first step of this is going to be to lay the white chocolate down with a stencil. Let that white chocolate firmly set up by putting this in the fridge, and then put some melted but cool dark chocolate spread across the entire piece of acetate so you get this one big solid wrap. So I'm going to be spreading off and onto the surface. The other point of prep to note here is that I am going to be moving this into the fridge, so I've got it on my cookie sheet to make it easy to move over to my fridge because I've got a long way to walk to my fridge. But more importantly, I've got it on a piece of parchment paper because I am going to be spreading chocolate onto the acetate. I don't want to get my cookie sheet totally messed up. So it'll just keep it a cleaner working area and allow for a little chocolate overflow. Okay, so let me start by stenciling. Because this is a cake stencil, but it's a pretty short cake stencil as cake stencils come. So I am going to have to do it a few times. I have trimmed down the edges already so that if I start the stencil here and I move it over, it should line up pretty darn well. You know, another alternative is the midpoint of this acetate is going to be the front of the cake because there's always a seam in the back. The other way to do this is to start your stenciling in the middle, but then you need to do 3 stencils to fill it out. So I'm going to start at the end and try to match it up as best as I can in the center. So that way we'll only have to do 2 stencils. You'll notice my stencil is bowing up there. That's not a great thing because if I spread the chocolate over it and it's lifted, it's just going to smudge underneath. And I'm working on the diagonal here so that my acetate actually fits the entire cookie sheet. So what I'm going to do while I'm stenciling is just hold down that side of the stencil so the stencil is sitting flush in contact with the acetate. So I've got that relatively flat. I am going to have to hold the stencil here as well because it's lifting at the bottom too. I've got my white chocolate. Again, it's melted but not tempered. And I'm going to bring that a little closer. And for this task, I'm using a small offset spatula, holding the stencil down the entire time and trying not to shift it. Now, once I get this one stencil down, I want to lift it up pretty quickly, because if I leave the stencil here and I allow the white chocolate to set, when I pull the stencil up, I'll lift up all this chunky chocolate with it, and I'll have a really rough edge to the stencil. So as soon as this is spread, and I don't want to go off the edge here, I got to be careful about that, because that's my point of intersection. So I just want to get that last dot, but I don't want to spread in that direction. I want to spread to the inside. You don't want to see through this chocolate, because then you'll have a really pale stencil, because I'm putting dark chocolate behind it. A little bit of dark chocolate is always going to show through, but we don't want that much to show through. Okay, so let me lift that off, and hopefully that'll be a pretty clean stencil. What I'm going to have to do is then rinse this stencil off, pat it dry, flat between towels, and come back and do the other side. That looks pretty darn good. There's a little bit of smudging here, but hopefully that'll be masked when we get the dark chocolate on top. So I'm going to rinse this off under low flow warm water, pat it dry, and then do the other half before that chocolate completely sets up. Okay, I'm back. I rinsed off my stencil and I patted it dry between paper towels. And you want to do that flat on your work surface. You don't want to scrub across the top of the stencil, or you'll lift finer points of it and then damage the stencil. When you damage a stencil, it's very easy for chocolate and whatever you're trying to stencil to flow underneath, and we don't want that. I've tried to match up as best as possible in dead center where I left off. And there might be a little bit of a gap there, but that's good. I'm going to hold that down flush too, because it's tending to lift. We're just going to go over it with more white chocolate. And again, I want to spread away from the center part so I don't get white chocolate onto the acetate where I don't want it. I just want it on top of the stencil right now. I'm going to do one final swoop, again holding down that area that's tending to pop up. And I didn't, I have a little bit of extra that won't have a stencil on it, but that's no big deal, because that'll be in the back of the cake. I'm going to move that chocolate aside, and I'm going to lift the stencil up, and I'm going to lift it away from the center of the cake, just so I don't mess up what I've already stenciled in pulling it off. And that looks pretty darn good. Okay, so I'm going to step the stencil aside. The next step is to let this chocolate fully set up, and I need to do that in the fridge. And then we're going to come over it with dark chocolate. If we don't firm up that white chocolate solidly, when I put that other chocolate over it, it can potentially melt it and cause it to smear. So we want to make sure this part is completely solid. When we then set up the dark chocolate, we won't set it up quite as firm, because we need some pliability to get it around the cake. So I'm going to go stick that in the fridge, and we'll be back and we'll do the dark chocolate piece. Okay, my white chocolate is fully set up. So I've got melted chocolate. It's also cool. It's melted but cool. And I'm going to dab it on top of the stenciled area, not apply a ton of pressure, because I don't want to smear that stencil. But I want to cover the entire acetate, because I want to have a solid chocolate wrap all the way up to the top of the cake. So in this case, I'm not applying very heavy pressure for all the reasons I mentioned. I'm just really trying to guard against smearing that stencil. And this makes a mess, hence the use of the parchment paper here, because what'll happen is once this dark chocolate sets up, I can just pop it off the parchment paper and reuse it. And then the next step, once this is all covered, is to just kind of carefully lift it up and make sure that there are no really see-through spots, because where they're really sheer see-through spots, you'll kind of have a hole in your lace. You don't want that. It's hard to see that from the top sometimes, but you can definitely see it when you lift it up. And this doesn't have to be super neat on the back, because it's going to be hidden. So if there's swipe marks, no worries. And you'll notice how thick and gloppy my chocolate is. That's because I've cooled it down to the point that hopefully it won't melt the white chocolate underneath. It's barely warm to the touch. And if it's any warmer, it will most definitely smear that white chocolate. But typically I'm not spreading this any thicker than the thickness of that white chocolate stencil. So it's going to still be a very delicate chocolate wrap when you cut into it. The key with cutting into these chocolate wraps, people often ask that, how do you do that? The key is just to use a hot knife. And don't worry if it breaks, just pick up the chocolate and eat it. Okay. Now I'm going to lift this up, and when I set this back down, actually it would be really helpful to have another piece of parchment paper to stick underneath it, because I don't want to set this down on wet chocolate, because then any chocolate on the outside of the acetate is going to be hard to remove. There looks to be a little shear spot, so I am going to fill that in. And let me look at the other side. But I didn't smear my white chocolate too much, so that's good news. And I'm not seeing too many shear spots elsewhere. So I'm going to go over those areas, and then I am going to step aside and get another piece of parchment paper and lift this onto a clean piece of parchment paper so this doesn't set up with any chocolate on the back side of it. And I do want to lift it and move it onto another piece of parchment paper, specifically also to clean up that top edge of the cake, because if I let it set up here, I'll have all this chocolate that's overflowing will be sticking up and creating a really uneven edge. So I'm going to break quickly, grab parchment paper, and then just lift it off and then stick it back on the fridge. Okay, I'm back. I'm moving this onto a clean piece of parchment paper because, as I said, I don't want any chocolate overflow setting onto the back of the strip. This also gives me an opportunity to just with my finger run along the top edge of the cake. That's the most important edge, to wipe off any little stray chocolate pieces. This will just kind of keep it straight. And you can also clean up that edge with a hot knife once it gets on the cake. Now the next step is to set that in the fridge so it's partially set up, and then we'll wrap it around the cake, chill it again, and then remove the acetate. Okay, this is out of the fridge, and you'll notice it's still pliable, but the chocolate isn't flowing off of it, and that's perfect. I'm going to start by anchoring the strip in the back, and the only area I'm really going to press it in is right here. My finger here melted a bit of the chocolate. I don't have the extra on this particular wrap that I do on some of the others, because I want a really straight edge at the top with chocolate, so I can't really cut any area for me to hold on to. But we'll conceal that with icing, so it's not a big deal. Now the next, I'm just wrapping around the front here, taking care to make sure the bottom edge aligns with the bottom of the cake, and then I don't wrap it up at an angle. And it just makes it. The other area where I secure it tightly is right here at the seam, so it doesn't pop off, as it is the tendency, it has a tendency sometimes to do. So we've got a pretty good wrap here. I think I might have a little extra chocolate on the face of this wrap, which we'll get off before we unwrap it. We want to get any chocolate off the face of the acetate, because it can sometimes cause the chocolate underneath to break when we unwrap. At this stage, though, I just want to make sure the wrap is pretty securely on there at the back. And another way to do that, to guard against the wrap kind of falling off when we unwrap, is to put a buttercream border at the top. So I've got about 1/4 of an inch of chocolate sticking up, and I'm just going to stick my border in there. I'm going to use a pretty big star tip this time because I've got a pretty big overhang. Again, this is just a securing mechanism. And I'm piping a pretty ample border purposely because I want to go close to the top of that overhang of chocolate. But this makes a nice little receptacle, actually. There's like a nice interior part where we're going to tumble some berries to finish off the cake. We'll just finish this border, and then it goes in for one last chill. So there are three important things to remember here with this particular wrap. Are A, that you want to make sure with the first chill of the white chocolate that white chocolate is solidly set up. Secondly, you want to make sure that the dark chocolate you spread on top is fluid and melted but cool, so that when you spread it over the white chocolate, it doesn't smear it. And then lastly, for the last chilling of the strip, you want to make sure you chill it to the point that the dark chocolate is still pliable, but not so chilled that you can't wrap it around the cake without cracking the chocolate. This will go now back in the fridge one last time, and this could stay in the fridge this way until you're ready to serve it, and then you can unwrap it, or you can do it in advance, as I often like to do. This will go in one last time until the chocolate's completely set, and then we'll peel the acetate off and I'll put a border, or maybe not a border around the bottom. It looks kind of clean and nice without it, and we'll decorate it with berries. So this particular setup will take a little bit longer than the last because we're fully setting it up, but still it's only, oh, maybe 10 to 15 minutes depending on how cool your fridge is. Okay, my cake is now out of the fridge after its final chilling, and the acetate's almost popping off on its own, which means that the chocolate's set up. So I'm just going to show you how I unwrap it, and then I will show you what a finished product might look like if I were to do a few more embellishments. So it's popping off on its own. I'm just going to gently pull it off all the way around. But when I want to stop when I come to the overlapped area. There's about a half an inch of chocolate overlap here. If I were just to pull this off, I'd take all that chocolate and possibly the rest of the wrap with it. So I've got a paring knife. I've heated the tip of the blade so that I can just more easily score through the chocolate on top. And you'll see it'll knock right off, which then allows me, whoops, I think I need to cut a little bit further in. That's a hot blade, watch out. My acetate ends a little bit further, so I'm going to trim a little bit further. I just want to trim enough to get that acetate out. That's beautiful. Move that over there. And then you can rinse that acetate off, clean it, and use it once again. And that's basically an unwrapped cake. I'm going to come back in, finish it with a few white chocolate dots, and then load some berries on top. And that's a simple and easy way to dress up a store-bought cake. And here's the finished product, complete with berries on top and some white chocolate dots to accent the stencil work. If you want to learn more about lace wraps, please visit my video about chocolate lace wraps that are done piped with chocolate and freehand. Until then, live sweetly.